And we're live. Hello and welcome to our virtual presentation of Ridgeline with author Michael Punke and our moderator, Michael Hampton. We do have signed book plates available for those who purchase Ridgeline tonight. To request one, please click on the green purchase button and it will take you to our website where you can complete your purchase. Just make sure to write signed book plates in the order comments when you're checking out your cart. Also, this event includes an audience Q&A. To submit a question, please use the Ask a Question feature at the very bottom of the screen. You can also vote for any questions you'd like, and they'll make their way to the very top of the list. Also, please consider supporting Vroman's Bookstore tonight because, it's been a tough year for all bookstores out there, and we've been around since the 1800s, so it's thankfully to patrons like yourselves and avid readers that keep our lights on. All right, so with that said, let me briefly introduce our speakers and then we can get started. So Michael Punke is the author of several books, including Last Stand, George Bird Grinnell, and The Revenant, a #1 New York Times bestseller and basis for the Academy Award-winning film. In his diverse professional career, Punke has served as the U.S. ambassador to the World Trade Organization in Geneva, a history correspondent for the Montana Quarterly, and an adjunct professor at the University of Montana. Joining him tonight is Michael Hampton, the Vice President of Appian Way Productions, which is behind many Academy Award and Golden Globe nominated and winning films, including The Wolf of Wall Street, The Aviator, The Ides of March, and of course, The Revenant. All right, so with that said, I'm going to turn my camera off and hand things off to the Michaels. Enjoy the talk, everyone.
Thank you all so much for that lovely introduction, and it's wonderful for me to be here and to be talking to my friend Michael Punke about this extraordinary book. And thank you to Vromans for inviting us. And what a nice segue that they've been around since the 1800s to then talk about a book that takes place in 1866. What a nice connection. But some of the films that were just referenced, yeah, right, for the company I work for, The Revenant should have been at the top of that list because I can't think of anything I've had. It was such a privilege to be able to work on that film. And it all began with an extraordinary book written by Michael Punke. And then about 6 months ago, long before it was published, I had the opportunity to read Ridgeline. Our whole company did. And to say it's extraordinary, I think is truly an understatement. It's a story that I knew very little about, which is what I really want to explore talking to you, Michael, because in a lot of ways, some of this we talked about, some of this we never have. But where this story came from, I didn't know about the Fetterman massacre. I knew of Red Cloud and Crazy Horse, but I didn't know them to the degree I did coming out of this book. Same thing with a character like Carrington. So many fascinating characters, such a fascinating piece of our American history. And so much of it was, for me, completely unknown. And that just made it even richer to dive into it. And the level of research you do, which we've already known, is at another level. And so I don't want to talk too much. I want all the viewers and listeners to hear from you. But I will start with a basic question because I don't think I've ever asked it in all the time we've talked about this book. But how long you have been thinking about it, where it came from? Was this something you wanted to write for 20 years, or is it something you stumbled upon after The Revenant and said, this is going to be another book? I'd love to. I do not know the origin of Ridgeline.
Well, it's actually more than 20 years that I've been thinking about this type of story. I think I've told you before that my greatest professional experience for writing this book, ironically, was a job I had in high school and college. I worked for the National Park Service, and I did something called living history interpretation, where I dressed up every day in an 1876 cavalry uniform and talked to tourists all day about the history of the West. And a very small incident that we talked about in that context was the Fetterman fight, the battle that this book is about. So I've kind of known about this particular incident for a long time. I've always really been interested in writing a book that was set during the Indian War era, but it wasn't really until fairly recently that I started looking for a new project and really discovered some of the depth of this that really made it exciting to me.
It's very cool. Very cool. And so you talk about the history of the West. You just referenced it. And I feel like in so much of what we see in books, and especially in film and television, and what I do for a living, is we're seeing it from a very narrow perspective. And I feel like one of the many amazing things about this book is the perspective that you are sharing or showing from the Lakota perspective, and going inside of Red Cloud and Crazy Horse. And I'd love to know about some of your process in terms of how to convey that perspective, and all of the research you did to discover it, and maybe even some of the other. I know there's a lot of contributors to the book and a lot of people that helped you along the way, to see how that all kind of came together.
Well, it's something I thought about a lot in doing the research on this, is kind of how to present the story in its full kind of multicultural glory. And it is such a big and rich story. One of the things that I feel really strongly about, and this actually goes back to the late 1980s, when I was talking about Western history on behalf of the National Park Service and the story that we were telling then, it started to be pretty clear to me, even as a teenager, that the story we were telling, kind of the official story, was remarkably incomplete and left out huge groups of people who are critical to that story, including Native Americans, including women. And so I was really convicted that I wanted to tell the story with all of those groups represented in a respectful and accurate way. And when I started doing the research on for the book itself, it became even more obvious to me kind of how important the Lakota characters were, and especially Crazy Horse. The challenge then, deciding that I wanted to have Crazy Horse be a central character, is to try and tell his story in an accurate and respectful way. And that's really where an enormous amount of research came in. But then beyond that, once I had a draft of the book, I started working into a network of Native American friends who helped me find Native American readers, actually 9 different Native American readers from 6 different tribes, who gave me feedback on the first draft. And I was able to then incorporate that feedback into later drafts, and hopefully make it that much more better and accurate in terms of the story.
Wow. And then, so I guess you should go back a little bit now, because for those who haven't had the privilege of reading the book yet, or are reading it, or about to read it, let's talk a little bit about sort of a snapshot beyond just a general synopsis of all the pieces of the book. Because I feel like the other thing that's so extraordinary about this is it's not just you're talking about, it is about the Fetterman massacre, but it's also about everything leading up to it. It's about those different perspectives and those different lenses. And I think it'd be fun to hear from your perspective, sort of the pieces of this story from your point of view.
Sure. Well, the nutshell of the story is, in the fall of 1866, the U.S. government breaks a treaty with a large number of Native American tribes and goes into this Powder River Valley, which is now in Wyoming, in what's now Wyoming, and occupies this land with a massive military force, and begins to build a huge fort. And this is not a small fort like you think of in the 1950s John Wayne movies. This is a massive fort that encompasses about 13 acres, really encompasses a whole city. And the Lakota realize what's happening, which is that a new civilization is being brought to displace theirs, the one that is there. And over the course of the fall, there's a series of escalating conflicts between the Lakota and the U.S. Army soldiers, as the Lakota try and discover how to fight against this new force. And all of that leads up to this massive battle, the Fetterman fight, that, as you said, is kind of one of those things that you read about and you're like, how did I not know about that before? Because it really is on the scale of something like the Battle of the Little Bighorn. We've all heard of Custer, but very few of us have heard of Fetterman. And so that's what's going on in the course of the book, is this. I tried to have it fairly tightly concentrated around a couple of months leading up to this in the fall, and then the big battle that takes place on December 21st, 1866.
And it's you referenced Battle of Little Bighorn and Custer, and why that is such a piece of history that we all are somewhat familiar with. And yet then an event like this that was so historic, in some ways equally historic, has been completely swept under the rug historically. Why do you think that is?
Well, for one thing, I think we don't have a very detailed knowledge of history generally. And so when something big like, the Battle of the Little Bighorn comes along, and more people did actually die in the Battle of the Little Bighorn. There's still a lot of people that die in the Fetterman fight. But I think it just kind of, I think the Custer fight sort of displaces the Fetterman fight, even though, as you say, in a lot of ways, I think this battle and the events that precede it are even more interesting, and in some ways even more emblematic of what was going on at that time. One of the really interesting things about this battle, and not just this battle, but it's connected to a war called Red Cloud's War, which Red Cloud was the Lakota chief who was the diplomatic and strategic genius behind the battle. And one thing that's interesting about this incident that I write about is the Lakota win. Without spoiling the drama, historically, the Lakota win this battle. And not only do they win the battle, but winning this battle leads them to win a war, which a lot of people don't realize, that there was a war that the Native Americans won. Now, we know that the end, 10 years later, it goes a different direction. But this is a moment in history where this brilliant battle results in the Lakota prevailing not just in a battle, but in a war.
And well, I have two questions based on that. First off, is that you comment again on Battle of Little Bighorn, which happens almost exactly 10 years later, pretty close.
That's right.
How would you say?
North.
Yeah, how would you say, both in terms of what happened with the Fetterman Massacre, what happened in 1866, drew a line or a connection to those events in 1876? I know that's almost kind of like where your book ends and where it goes, but one of the most fascinating things in your book is feels like an untold story, which is almost a prequel to a story we all know. So I'd love to know a little bit more about the connection between those two periods.
Sure. Well, I mean, if you look at this from a really big kind of macro historical perspective, and I love to do that because I love this history so much. The period really before 1866, there'd been lots of conflict, and I'm focused just on conflict between Native Americans and the U.S. in the kind of western travel corridor of kind of the Oregon Trail. Obviously, there'd been huge wars and fought with Native Americans and European Americans since the time that the Columbus first landed in 1492. But in the American West, and I'm talking about now really the Rockies, what the U.S. government really tried to do for the period between the start of the gold rush in the 49ers in 1849 and this period in 1866 is they tried to kind of sort of push the Native American tribes away from this central corridor that was the Oregon Trail. And that was fairly successful in avoiding some conflict. But what happens in 1866 is gold is discovered in Montana. And this old treaty that they had created, they just threw out the window because all of a sudden they wanted to veer off the Oregon Trail, go north up to Montana, which required them to break a treaty and go into these lands that had been explicitly given to the Lakota, the Cheyenne, the Arapaho by treaty. And so from 1866 on, all the way to the end of the Indian Wars, which happens effectively about a year and a half after the Custer fight, there's this escalating and dramatic conflict. And so I think you're right. These two incidents really do connect, and they're the beginning and the end, or near the end, of the really escalated period of the Indian War period.
Fascinating. So now let's talk a little bit about character, since this one has an abundance of them. And we talked,
in this book.
There is. So, I guess first off, I mean, we definitely touched on Crazy Horse and Red Cloud, and I'd like to get back to them in a moment. But in terms of the other side, there's Henry Carrington, Colonel Carrington, and I think it's a great place to start in terms of what a complex and fascinating character he is, and the sort of perspective that he has coming into this story, and what ultimately happens. Without giving away too many spoilers from the book, I'd love to talk a little bit about him before we get into William Fetterman.
Yeah. Well, the characters on the side of the U.S. Army are fascinating characters, and all of them, with a couple of small exceptions, are all the major characters in the book are real, based on real people. It's fictionalized, of course. It's a novel, but they're based on real, and I tried to craft them in as historically accurate of a way as possible. Carrington is the overall commanding officer of these forces. He's the colonel, and what's interesting to me about Carrington is he's horribly picked for this job. All of the other officers at this fort are Civil War battle veterans, and they don't know about fighting in the West against Native American tribes, but they know about combat and fighting. And their commanding officer, by contrast, doesn't know anything about fighting. In the Civil War, he was a logistics guy. He, made the trains run on time. And they pick him badly because they think his job is going to be building this fort. They think he's going to essentially be a builder and then kind of the mayor of this town. And instead, he ends up in the most dangerous, conflict-laden place on the continent. And he's the wrong man, patently the wrong man for the job. Clearly based on the outcome. And then we keep referencing the Fetterman massacre. There is a Fetterman, William Fetterman. I'd love to hear you touch a little bit more about him. So Fetterman by history has been portrayed as the villain of this incident, and I think wrongly, based on some more recent scholarship that's been done on this battle by some people who've written some interesting nonfiction books about the battle. But history kind of assigned him as the kind of arrogant villain. There's another guy who I think was the actual arrogant villain in this story. Fetterman, I portrayed in the book, and I think accurately, as somebody who was more conflicted and had his own reservations about how they should be approaching this task that the Army had been given of protecting miners and settlers who were traveling on this road. And so to me, he's a fascinating character among the officers because he occupies this kind of middle ground. I think he's very contemporary in some ways because I think he believes that he can channel the darker forces of some of the other characters for his benefit. And I won't reveal too much, but that turns out to be a very significant challenge. And these other characters with some of these darker instincts really end up, at the end of the day, driving events in a way that I think got out of Fetterman's hands.
Yeah, absolutely. And then you reference the sort of key officers that you portray in the book, and there's Harrington, there's Fetterman, and then there's Vroman. And I'd be curious for you to, Vroman is another one that I definitely wanted to hear your sort of perspective on for those, whether they're reading or have read or about to read the book.
So I know it's fashionable to craft villains who are a little bit good or mostly good, but a little bit bad. Vroman, I believe, historically was a class A asshole. And, my evidence for that includes the fact that he was court-martialed in the Civil War for shooting an unarmed civilian, for pistol whipping one of his own non-commissioned officers. And I won't reveal his marital proclivities, but let's just say that fidelity is not his strong suit. So there's a lot of evidence there historically that Vroman is a not great guy. And then in addition to that, I think the best historical evidence is that he probably bears the most blame for things that unfold in the final battle, which people are probably guessing doesn't go super well for the U.S. Army.
Right, right. I think it'll be clear to anyone who reads the book that they'll agree with you on what a grade A asshole he may indeed be. I'd also love for you to touch on, because I know it's something that we've joked about, but there's a character named Jim Bridger, who
there is indeed.
Yes, may be familiar.
Behind my shoulder there on the wall.
I see. I'd love for you to talk a little bit about Jim Bridger behind your shoulder, and maybe his connection to something else you may have written over the course of your illustrious career.
Yeah. So, as somebody who loves history, there were moments doing the historical research for this that were just like those finding gold moments of like, you can't believe how lucky you are that something really happened that you can then write about. And one of those moments for me was, for people who saw or read The Revenant, Jim Bridger. The Revenant takes place in 1823, so 43 years before the events in this book. Jim Bridger is one of the two people in The Revenant who abandons Hugh Glass. He's the boy character played by Will Poulter. He goes on, it turns out, after this infamous incident of abandoning Hugh Glass, to have a storied career, and he becomes famous as this incredible explorer, and he does all these things in the West for which he's well regarded, and even is known as having a real strong moral character. So he kind of evolves past this incident in his youth to become this, I think, a very good person. Who looks like that, not like Michael Hampton, by the way, but the portrait on my wall is of Jim Bridger at about the age he would have been in this book. And one of the things I discovered is in 1866, Jim Bridger is 63-year-old scout for the U.S. Army. And I was just elated that this character that I was quite enamored with from The Revenant would show up in real life in the events that I was going to be writing about in Ridgeline. And not only Jim Bridger, by the way, but he has a friend of his, a fellow scout, a real life character named James Beckworth, who is a mixed race, also famous mountain man, whose mother was a black slave, whose father was a white slave owner. James Beckworth's father frees him as a teenager. James Beckworth goes out west at the same time that Jim Bridger was out west. They grow up together, and then they're older men scouting for the Army in 1866. So that was kind of a discovering both of those guys show up in this story was a fun part of the research.
Oh yeah, for sure, for sure. You beat me to it on Beckworth. That was going to be my next question. Was to touch on Beckworth. I'd also be curious. It's such a fascinating ensemble that you've created, and again, so rich that I'd love just, before we move on from the sort of character portion, if there were any other characters that you wanted to touch on that you enjoyed writing to or researching, that some of those nuggets, like gold nuggets, like you talked about with Bridger, that we could talk about today.
Well, I love the character of Frances Grumman. She's again, real life character. The Class A asshole guy, Lieutenant Grumman, is married. He has a brand new bride. She's 19 years old in the events of this book. She's a former Tennessee belle. Her family was aligned with the Union during the war. Tennessee was very split. Grumman meets her at the end of the war when the Union Army is occupying the area around her former plantation. They marry. She marries Grumman believing that she's going to go live in New York City, which they do for a couple of months. She thinks she's going to have this kind of very fancy life in the big city. And literally months later, her husband is sent out to the Powder River Valley of Wyoming. She finds herself in one of the most remote and dangerous places on the planet. She discovers she's pregnant, and she begins to discover, I think pretty quickly, certainly in my rendition, that her husband is not quite the person that she thought he was when she married him. So she's a great character. I wrote her character through the device of journal entries. And I got the idea for that because in real life, Frances Grumman wrote an autobiography that I read, and it was great because I could get a real feel for kind of her voice and personality. And then I had the idea, women in that era in particular wrote a lot of journals. And I thought writing a journal would be a fun way to really get in her head as a character and just kind of break up the narrative a little bit with journal entries and use that device to kind of carry the story along. So I love her character. I think she's fascinating.
Absolutely. I'm so glad you touched on Frances. And was there anybody else you wanted to mention for our readers before we move on?
Well, one more that I can't help, and this one was also catnip for me, both as somebody who loves history, but also somebody who loves Western literature. One of my favorite books of all time is Lonesome Dove by Larry Mcmurtry. It turns out Mcmurtry based that story in part on the story of a real life cowboy named Nelson Story, who drives a herd of Texas Longhorns from Texas to Montana. He happens to do that in 1866, and literally while everything else is going on that I've been talking about, Nelson Story and 20 Texas cowboys show up in the middle of the Powder River Valley with a herd of 1,000 Texan Longhorns. And he, as you might imagine, is an amazing character in and of himself. It's not a big part of the story, but I absolutely could not resist putting Nelson Story in.
That's yeah, it's terrific. You mentioned Larry Mcmurtry. I would kick myself if I didn't ask, again, what might be a little bit of an obvious question, but I don't know if I've ever asked it to you before, which is, who are some of the other authors that line up your bookshelf and over the years, again, of your amazing career that have been influences on you? And I'd love to know just a couple of those authors and a couple of those books that are real touchstones for you.
Well, I can tilt my, when you say who lines my bookshelf, I can tilt over to the books that I keep on my shelf.
You know?
I know, that's the books that I have on my shelf are not on my shelf, but on my desk, which are the ones that are sort of nearest and dearest to my heart, I guess. I have Lonesome Dove by Larry Mcmurtry. I have True Grit by Charles Portis. River Runs Through It by Norman MacLean. I've got The Call of the Wild by Jack London. And then just to mix in some international, I've got Gulag Archipelago by Solzhenitsyn, and I've got The Little Prince by Saint-Exupéry. So those are the books on my desk, the ones nearest to my heart.
Yeah, I don't think anyone would disagree. That's a pretty good list. That's a pretty impressive lineup. So just going back to the book again, then I know I'd love to see if there's anyone who has other questions, and I'll stop talking. One of the things that I love so much about the book is it's such a thrilling read. Sometimes I think, and even working for the company I work for, we do a lot of we look at a lot of historical pieces, we tell a lot of true stories, and sometimes, you can get bogged down in sort of the details and the research, and your book is filled with all those details and research, yet it's got this incredible pulse to it that just wants to see where it's almost like a war film leading up to the war, and seeing all these elements and sides and so much tension built into it that it's like reading a thriller as much as it is reading a piece of history. Thriller may be the wrong word, but I think, that propulsive sort of, feeling that goes throughout the whole book. And I'd love just for you to speak to a little bit of that in terms of, where it came from in terms of the sides and sort of the strategic of it, the tactical side of it, what the Lakota were able to do that made them successful. It's just, again, without giving away too much of the book, it's the ride I would love for you to talk a little bit about.
Sure. Well, I'm glad that it affected you that way, because it makes me feel good as a writer that I, for you anyway, was able to pull that off. I definitely think there's a risk with historical books of getting kind of so drawn down in who did what, when, and this happened, and then this happened, and then this happened, that you lose kind of the human drama of these historical events. And this is an event that starts off with such incredible drama for the Lakota, because one of the things that, and I have this happen very early on in the book, when Crazy Horse first sees the army marching up the Powder River Valley, it's a huge group. And not only is it soldiers, but Crazy Horse sees that they have women and children with them, and they even bring along a sawmill to manufacture logs, or to manufacture boards from logs. Crazy Horse realizes instantly that what's going on is a new civilization is being brought to displace them. And the stakes are just instant for him and for the rest of the tribes, because they realize that losing this war means losing their home, their culture, their lives. And so those stakes are set very early on. You know, the challenge then, I love action stories, and you saw from some of the books on my shelf or my desk that I love stories that are, I love your word of propulsive. I'm going to try and always write propulsively going forward, because it's a great word. But I love stories that kind of carry the reader along with action. But I also think that there's a trap with action stories, if you're not careful, that you can be so focused on the battles that you lose track of the people who are fighting them. And what I really was striving for in this book is, by the time we get to that massive battle at the end, and I write it expansively, but by the time we got to that, I wanted people to really know on both sides who was fighting and dying. And so that there was really a stake, a sense of the stakes, and that people cared about the people that they should care about, and loathed the people they should loathe, so that sentiment is right there as part of the battle. So that was kind of the goal, is to create that action and propulsion all the way through, but do it with characters that people had come to know and care about.
Well, I'll wrap up my portion by saying I think you've done that remarkably with this book, but in every book you've ever written, where it does feel like you begin with character. You begin with those characters and investing in them emotionally, no matter how you want to feel about them, you know, to what degree. And once you have that investment, then of course, you know, throughout all of the battles or all of the circumstances, you know, like where you're sort of hitching your wagon is the wrong term, but able to connect. And right. I think a lot of stories suffer because they begin with plot and then character comes second. And I think with your books, it's always the other way around. I hope you feel that.
Good. I'm aiming for that. I'm aiming for that. I mean, the great thing about writing about a great historical story is a lot of these incidents and characters, at least the outline and the bones for them, are pitched up by history. And it's one of the reasons I love history so much, is history is full of great stories. That said, you know, I've written both fiction and nonfiction. And what is most fun to me about fiction versus nonfiction is it really invites you to fill in the blanks that history doesn't write. And a lot of those blanks are things like, what did it feel like? You know, not just what happened, but what did it feel like when Crazy Horse saw his homeland being invaded? What did it feel like to be a recent German immigrant who finds himself on the far-flung frontier? What did it feel like to be Frances Drummond, discovering that she married somebody who was different than she thought she married? Those are great kind of novel moments to me. And I thought that this story gave a lot of opportunities for those kind of moments.
It sure does. It sure does. Again, I've spoken too much. So if there's, if I don't know if our wonderful moderator wants to chat, hello.
Hello, I'm back.
Another question, so somebody can hear, Michael Punke can hear somebody else's voice besides mine.
All right. A reminder to those who are watching, if you would like to submit a question for the audience Q&A, just click on the Ask a Question feature at the very bottom of the screen. You could submit your question that way. And we have 2 questions on here. So The first question is, when do you know it's time to end the research and start writing the book?
Well, that's a great question. And I actually do it in stages. I'm a big believer in outlining, mostly because I can't keep track of things. If I don't, I put yellow stickies on a whiteboard to keep track of characters and chapters, and I outline a lot. So I kind of do a macro, view from 30,000, view from 20,000 version of the history, just to kind of get a sense of where I think I want to go with major characters and kind of major events. And then I do a lot of research as I'm going along. So all of the skirmishes that I write about in this book before the big battle at the end, all of the skirmishes are based on real incidents. And so, for example, in writing each of those smaller skirmishes and fights and guerrilla attacks along the way leading up to the battle, I would go back in before writing that particular chapter and reread the sources I had about a particular incident like that. Or if Jim Bridger was going to be, there's great scenes where Jim Bridger and James Beckworth are riding their horses across the open prairie together, talking. And so for that scene, I was diving back in to the materials I had. There's a great biography. It's kind of written it's an old book, but it has a lot of great material in it about James Beckworth. And I was going back and rereading that to get ideas for what would be the things that James Beckworth would be talking about as they rode across the prairie. So I go back and forth a lot.
Sounds like a very meticulous process. So this question that we have right here, what is the photo below Jim Bridger behind you, Mr. Punk?
So that photo right there is a photo of from a book, a nonfiction book I wrote about a mining disaster in Butte, Montana in 1917. And it is a picture that is thought to be a specific crew that worked in a mine there called the Speculator that was involved in this disaster that I wrote about. So I found that picture when I was doing the research for the Butte book over in the Butte archives, and I love it because when you look at the faces in that photo, it could be like a high school football team. They're so young, and it just makes it so tragic that they're 2,000 feet below ground in a mine and involved in this disaster. So anyway, it's kind of a muse wall in part, I guess.
I mean, I love the decorations that you have on your wall. We were talking about that before we started the talk. So thank you, Elise, for bringing that up. So our next question is, what is the most surprising fact you've learned in your research for this book?
That's a great question. I mean, there are a couple of surprises that I talked about, just the joy of discovering these characters who popped up in the middle of a book that I was going to write that I was really excited to be, finding historically in this story, like Bridger, like Beckworth, like Nelson's story. But from a broader standpoint, in terms of kind of surprises, things that I learned a lot about, I've done a lot of research on the Indian War era. And I guess I'm surprised anew and horrified anew at the degree of betrayal as a government that we engaged in breaking treaties that are as explicit as you can imagine about lands that were given to various tribes at various junctures. And there just are so many times in our history, including 1866, the summer before the events in this book, where we just break the treaties. And it is, I'm a lawyer by training, and you don't need to be a lawyer to know that what was happening was wrong. And so it's not a surprise, because I think we all know that at some level, but the starkness of it is sometimes still surprising.
Yeah, definitely. Okay, so I think we have time for One last question, and both of you touched up on this earlier, but I want to give you a chance to expand on it. What is the most challenging part of adapting a historical figure into a character? And I would like to expand that question by saying, like, in terms of writing it into fiction, as well as adapting it into film with an actual actor who is acting out the character.
I'm going to make Michael go first. I'm interested in what he's going to say about all of it, but including the actor piece of it.
That's a tough question. I can't believe you're kicking that over to me. My goodness. It's for us, you know, working for Appian Way, working for Leonardo, having worked on The Revenant and all the other, you know, films that you've talked about. It is interesting because we're a very book driven company. I'd say 80% of what we work on, if I had to put a number on it, was based on those adaptations. And I think it's because, and a lot of them are true stories. I think we tend to lean more towards nonfiction than fiction. And that's led us to do a lot of documentaries in the last 5 years. And I don't know if this necessarily answers the question. And I'm not just saying this because I'm on with an author like Michael Punke, but it's when you have the foundation of a great piece of literature and a great piece of fiction or nonfiction, it just makes everything so much easier for the author who's adapting it, and for the director who's going to, you know, be capturing it, and in this case of working for an actor, the actor who's going to be starring in it. There's no better foundation than that kind of a book, than a book of like what we're talking about right now. It makes all of our jobs so much easier. So now when people are always talking about different IPs and different ideas and different places to go and how we adapt things, or, you know, spec scripts or however it works, I think it's always best to look to the kind of books, whether they're being written, whether written 100 years ago or written, you know, or coming out next year, or in this case, coming out in June. And I'm not just saying that because I'm with Vromans either, but it's like that's where it all begins and ends for us. And I think we'll always be a very book-driven company for that very reason. I don't know if that exactly answers. My way of plugging both of you as well.
Well, I appreciate that for sure. So thanks. One piece of that I'll comment on, and I don't know if this helps to answer the question too, but I think one of the challenges of adapting a historical character is, how do you figure out kind of what's real, even from quote unquote history, and kind of what's myth. And some of these characters, and, you know, people like Crazy Horse and Jim Bridger have been such huge heroes of mine my whole life, that it was challenging to make sure that I didn't turn them into people who weren't human beings anymore. And with Crazy Horse, there was a real opportunity in this story to do that, I thought, for one thing, because he's pretty young. You know, we talked about the Battle of the Little Bighorn, and he's a hero in that battle as well. That's 10 years later. He was he was probably in his mid 30s by then. At the time that Ridgeline story takes place, he's in his early 20s. And I think and this is kind of the way that I write him, you certainly are seeing the potential for greatness there. He was already respected by his tribe as a warrior, as a hunter, but he makes mistakes too, quite human mistakes, and mistakes that you make as a young person. He's impulsive, and, for example, he doesn't always control his temper. And so I thought, you know, in your question, how do you portray a historical character? One of the fun parts of it in this story was the fact that this was a particular part in Crazy Horse's life where I think he was still becoming the person that he was ultimately going to be.
Well, thank you so much for your thoughtful answer. And thank you to everyone who tuned in. This was such a lovely conversation. I feel like I learned so much about the time period. And again, we have signed book plates available for those who purchase Ridgeline tonight. Just click on the green purchase button directly below the viewer screen, and just write signed book plate when you're checking out your cart in the order comments. And also, to those who tuned in late, don't worry, a replay of this talk will be available very shortly. We'll also be re-uploading this talk onto our YouTube channel in a couple of days. And I think that about does it. Thank you again, Michael.
Thank you.
And
Thanks,
Michael.
Thanks, Michael.
Thank you all very much.
Have a good night, everyone.
Yeah, thank you.
All right, stay safe.